I hope that you can all see my screen, and I hope that we're good to go. Thank you again. Gareth is my name. I work, as George was saying, as our colleague was saying, for a company that's called Research Square Company. A bit more about that in a moment. But today, over the next couple of hours, over the time that we have together, we are going to be talking about academic writing and publishing for success, tips and tricks and ideas for getting your fantastic, excellent research published in high impact factor journals. I would ask everybody to please not be shy. Don't be shy. Do put questions, do put comments, do put any feedback into the chat. We will have lots of time in our breaks and at the end of our session today to answer any and all of your questions. So do put any questions into the chat box. Let's get going. Let's get into it. Academic writing and publishing for success. Here's what we're going to be doing today. Together, we're going to have 3 sessions. The first one, starting now, we'll be talking about writing and communicating in English. Very important, of course. I know that this is often a major issue for researchers around the world, communicating their research effectively in English. So don't worry, we're here to help. That's why we do these sessions. That's why we are here today, to help you with your language communication skills, part of the process of getting your work accepted in those highest tier international journals. In our second session, we shall talk about strategies for targeting and publishing articles in high impact factor journals. And then thirdly, we will discuss a little bit about managing that publication process. All of it targeted to help especially early career researchers. This fantastic program is developed, is aimed, is targeted at early career researchers. So that's our focus today. Again, don't forget, please do put any of your questions or comments into the chat box, and we will get to them as we go through our session today. You're probably thinking, who's this guy shouting at me in English today? Well, my name's Gareth. I worked for 25 years as a full-time researcher, as an academic at different universities in Ireland, in the UK, in the United States, and I've published about 300 odd papers, some in Nature, some in Science, a number of books, book chapters. Some of my work got quite highly cited. Some of it, of course, did not get quite highly cited, but experience as a researcher, as a writer, as a communicator, I think that experience, combined with the fact that I also, for almost 20 years now, have been working as a journal editor. I work also as the editor-in-chief of a journal that's published by Taylor and Francis. I have the opportunity to provide insights on the publication process, writing and publishing academic articles from both the researcher's perspective and from the editor and peer review management perspective. So we're going to give you some tips. We're going to give you some tricks, some insights to help you more successfully get your work written up and published in those high impact factor journals. So we'll begin our first session this afternoon with a discussion of some of those common scientific writing issues, mistakes, communication problems that researchers often have in English. English, of course, the language that we use to communicate our science with the world. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon whether it is your native language or a second language, we spend a lot of time working with colleagues around the world for whom English is not their first language. And so the first thing that I would like to say in this session is that you can improve your writing. English communication, communicating in a second language, is a skill that you can develop. It's not a talent, and we have edited, our company, other companies, other people have edited hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of academic articles. So we know about some of the very, very common English language mistakes that researchers tend to make. So learning from the experience of others, learning from those who've come before, can help us also to improve our communication by understanding the kinds of issues that are often encountered in the publication process. But you know, you wouldn't just get in a car and start to drive down the road. You wouldn't just pick up a trumpet and start to play it. You'd take training, and that's important to note. Your English communication can be developed. You can learn the skills to develop your communication, because all of us get letters like this. Dear sir, dear madam, many thanks for asking whether we would like to publish your paper. It's good and original, but we are simply not willing to publish it at our journal because the good bits were not original and the original bits were not good. English language is a blocker. It's an issue for many colleagues around the world getting their work published in international journals. Here you can see on this slide some of the reasons why international publishers often reject articles submitted to their journals. English language issues are a key reason for rejection at international journals. And that's part of the reason that we provide these training sessions, to help researchers understand how to manage the communication process, manage the language process, to ensure that your fantastic research has the best possible chance of reaching a global audience. Because, of course, you're doing fantastic research. You wouldn't be in the position that you're in if you weren't doing great research. But communicating that research to journals, managing peer review, ensuring that editors at journals like Nature and Science get the message of your study is part of the process. It's something that you can learn to do more effectively with your own research, with your own articles. Academic papers, academic research articles often need to be well written and to a higher standard of English than you might find in other mediums. And I hope to convince you, I hope to show you in our training sessions today that you can enjoy the process. I know perhaps you're not thinking that's very enjoyable at the moment, but the writing process can be beneficial as an intellectual activity in its own right. But you're asking how? How can I improve my writing skills in English? The key thing, the key point is that we will not let our academic research messages be buried in language problems. As we mentioned already, as we talked about before, one of the key issues with rejection at international journals is that the message, the research message, is buried in language problems. And so understanding that, learning to communicate your research message effectively to international journals is the starting point of the process. And to illustrate this, I give you three of my own heroes as English writers. Winston Churchill, he was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. Of course, he was famous for communicating effectively in English. JFK, the American president, famously said about Churchill that he was able to mobilize the English language and send it into battle. And that's what we are going to help you to do with your own writing. The other two people on this slide are English journalists. One, Hadley Freeman, taught me a lot about writing. You write as you think, and that's something that we'll come back to in a moment. The other journalist that you see here, he couldn't write. He was so dyslexic that he couldn't actually write anything down himself. He had to speak everything that he wrote into a dictaphone, recording his voice and then writing down from that voice recording. The point here is that English communication, writing skills can be developed. We will show you how you can do this over the course of our presentation, because when you start to write an academic article, it's very, 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 very important to be like Arnold, to be like Mr. Schwarzenegger in the middle of the slide, to have a plan. When you put together a paper as a non-native English speaker, you need a structure in mind before you begin the writing process, a structure. How do you feel when you're faced with a difficult writing task? How do you start that writing task? You need a plan beforehand, and this is the key to successful academic writing in English. If it's not your first language, you do need a structure for the paper that you plan to write before you begin. I would ask you, over the course of our sessions together today, if you forget everything else that we're going to talk about, please remember this. Before you begin to start writing an academic paper, you need three things. Three things. A message. What is the takeaway message of your article? What is the key thing that you have discovered, you have answered in your paper? The message. The audience is the second thing to have in mind before you begin writing. Your audience, that is your target journal. Have a journal in mind before you begin writing, and we'll come back to that later in our training sessions today. Message, audience, your target journal, and the structure of your writing. And of course, once you have a target journal in mind, you get the structure of the paper that you plan to write from the target journal. That makes the process much, much easier. A structure, a plan for the paper that you plan to write will help you with the process a very, very, very great deal. So be like Arnold, develop a structure. We will help you to do that in this training today, and hopefully in future sessions that we may end up having together. Your plan for writing is very important. Lots of people, lots of researchers, they sit down and they start to write, and then once the paper is finally finished, they think, where am I going to submit this paper? What journals could I send it to? And that's the wrong way. That's the not so efficient way of thinking about the process. A target journal in mind before you begin is better, more effective for you to do this and get your work targeted for leading international journals. So one of the questions that we often get, how can I write more effectively in English? Well, try to think in English and write as you think. Try to think about your research in English and write a little bit every day. If you can, write just a few sentences, a few phrases about your research each day into that structure that you're developing for your article. That will help a great deal. And my best piece of advice, find other papers in your field written by native speakers that you like, you use, you cite, and that you respect, because you can use those papers for style, for shape, for structure. You can see how successful English native speaking academics in your research field put papers together. And I would say as well, if you translate, please find a subject area specialist. But it's better if you can to start to think about your research in English and do that a little bit each day with your message, your audience, and your structure for each of the articles that you put together. Very important. Please remember, if you can, the 3 things to know before you start to write an academic paper. And we know plain English. What is that? Commentators have identified 6 features of good plain English, and they share similar views on each. And this is a real paper published in the Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology, The Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilized Without Necessity, the Problems of Using Long Words Needlessly. In your academic English, in your articles, you should be using short sentences, no unnecessary words, familiar words, the active voice rather than the passive voice, appropriate style, and good punctuation. And I will help you, I will show you some examples in a moment of how to do this, but these are things to be aiming for with your academic English, with your academic writing, in order that it is clear and that it is easy to understand in your papers. And these steps, these ideas for writing, also make it easier for us as writers to put the paper together. So, for example, I could write this: in order to ascertain the efficaciousness of the program, the participants who took part were interrogated at some point upon program completion. Now, I don't know about you, but I had to look up the meaning of some of those words in my dictionary. It would have been better to write this. To determine the success of the program, we questioned the participants afterwards. There's no need to be overly complicated in your English writing. Lots of people think that if they use long words, that's going to make them look more intelligent. That's going to make their paper look more fancy. But that is not what we want in our English academic writing. And the reason for this is, of course, that most people reading and using and citing your academic research articles will not be native speakers. Where's most of the research being done around the world these days? It's being done in non-native speaking countries. We need to write clearly and simply in our academic research articles so that our content, our message, is accessible to readers in other disciplines, and of course for readers for whom English is not their first language. Common question from researchers: Gareth, won't using simple language in my writing make me appear less intelligent? No, the majority of academic papers are read by non-native speakers, and so it's important to be simple, to be clear, and to be direct. Short sentences, no unnecessary words, active voice rather than the passive voice in your writing. And as our friend Albert Einstein is famous for saying, the definition of genius is taking the complex and making it simple. So keep that in mind with your writing as well. We are going to encourage you to think, when writing academic articles, about your readers. Your readers. The reason for this is that we don't write academic papers in order to stick them on the wall or give them away as Christmas presents to our parents. We write academic papers to get citations, to get read, and to get used. And so the most important people in the publishing process are readers, users of your research. And good writers think about these 3 learning principles when putting their papers together. Cognitive load. How much new information can my readers process? Cognitive bias. Very important when targeting your work to journals, because you cannot assume that your readers know the same amount about the subject as you do, especially if you are targeting your research to higher impact factor journals where the readership will be bigger, the readership will be more general. Cognitive bias. and reader expectations, how you will logically present the content, the information in your article to your readers. Keep these 3 principles in mind when writing. Think about being simple, think about being direct with your writing. We will return to these issues in a moment, but goals for writing effectively in English: short sentences, aiming for 10 to 20 words per sentence. Varying, of course, your sentence length makes your writing more interesting, but keeping it short where possible. And very importantly, 1 idea per sentence. That's the concept of topic sentences. English is better in short, abbreviated sentences, using limited punctuation and thoroughly explaining your ideas to your readers. One of the best ways to do this is to read out your work aloud. Stand in front of the mirror, talk to the cat, talk to the dog, read out your papers, and make sure you are understandable, deleting unnecessary words, making your articles shorter where possible, making those sentences shorter and easier to understand where possible. And this is a structural comment, a structural tip for writing, because you will see these pyramid shapes as you start to put together the different sections of your papers. But generally speaking, in, for example, the introduction to an academic paper, you are writing in the shape of a pyramid upside down. You're starting general, giving the reader the big picture, talking about why the research is important for everybody, for an overall readership, and then building that down to the specifics at the end of the introduction. Nobody wants to read all about the nitty-gritty, the specifics of your research at the start of the paper. They want to be told why the paper is interesting, why the work, the research is important for a big readership. That's your message. Think about why your research topic is broadly interesting, why lots and lots of people around the world, the general readership of a journal like Nature or Science, why they would be interested in learning about your topic, and then build that down to the specifics towards the end of the introduction. Don't worry, we'll come back, we'll talk about this in more detail, but generally speaking, this is what we are aiming for. One big mistake that research writers make is starting their papers with very specific information about that particular piece of research, and people shut off, people don't read it, and editors at higher impact factor journals think this is not so interesting to the big broad readership of my journal. So keep that in mind as a writer. In our second session this afternoon, we'll talk about targeting your research to journals, selling your message to higher impact factor journals. But let's have a think in the second part of our session, this first session, quickly about some of the common English language errors, some of the common English language issues that researchers tend to have when writing papers. And here are the 4 top ones: plagiarism, tenses, spelling conventions, and the use of inappropriate words. Very important, your communication in your paper is the window into your article. If it's poorly written or clumsily written or strangely written to the editor and the peer reviewer, the chances are they will reject the paper. So knowing about these kinds of issues can certainly help a lot, speeding and smoothing your paper through the submission process. Of course, plagiarism, we don't need to talk about it all that much in this session. Plagiarism, of course, though, is a big issue in academic publishing, often because it happens by mistake. By mistake. A lot of people do not realize, for example, that if they have published a paper before, including figures, including data, including maps, they must cite that previous work in subsequent publications. Self-plagiarism is unfortunately very common in academic publishing, and it's a reason why a journal would reject a paper that you write and submit, because publishers send papers automatically through plagiarism checking software. So your paper, when it goes to a journal, will be checked for plagiarism. So if you are unaware of these different kinds of plagiarism, you can get caught out by mistake almost. Mosaic plagiarism, where you include data from various sources, mix it together, make it seem original. Paraphrasing, so even if the words are different, the idea remains the same, and you will get caught by the software packages. And most common and most unfortunate, failing to cite your own previous work, even if you're revisiting an old idea or a previously published observation. It's happened to me, it can happen to you. Citing earlier work of your own is very important, as well as citing the work of other researchers in your paper. So accidentally, this can happen. One of the most common ways that academic articles do tend to get rejected. So do consider having your work checked before submission, keeping careful records of all of the reference sources, keeping notes of what you've read and cited back into your paper. And keep in mind that international journals are looking for plagiarism scores of less than 10% when they check your work at initial submission. They won't send your paper out for review if it fails a plagiarism check. And this is what one looks like. You can see here, this paper has failed the plagiarism check. It's got a plagiarism score of 32%. The software, Turnitin, and other pieces of software are searching against standard databases, places like Crossref, Scopus, for example, against your work to make sure that you are in good shape for peer review. So be aware of this. It really is a big issue in academic publishing. All of the papers that we handle at the journal that I edit automatically go into a Turnitin plagiarism check before they go out for peer review. And quite a large proportion of them do get rejected before that peer review stage. Don't forget that higher impact factor journals have higher rejection rates. That's part of the reason for their higher impact factor. You need to keep that in mind. We'll talk later about managing rejection in our second session today as well. It's very common in academic research, of course, how you deal with rejection. But getting your papers published, managing that communication to make sure that your work has the highest possible chance of acceptance depends on remembering that you are writing for your readers. Many researchers forget this. They think that they're writing papers for themselves, for other like-minded researchers, but you should be thinking about your readers, how they will experience your paper, and getting your message across to your readers is very important. And it's often more important than being correct in the writing itself. And so with that in mind, keeping your writing simple, people often ask us, which tense should I use for the different sections of my next research paper? Keep it simple. Present tense for most of your paper. Present tense for accepted facts, background information. Present tense in the results. Present tense in the discussion. Forget about the imperfect tenses in English. Forget about the complicated tenses. Keeping the writing simple. Present tense most of your paper. Of course, your methods section, you talk about what you've done. You talk about what you did. That's going to be in the past tense. In the discussion, when you talk about what you might do in the future, research that you might do in the future as a result of this study, as a result of other studies that you cite in your article will be in the future tense, but 80% of your article in the simple present tense. Don't mix up within sentences, within phrases, between these different styles of writing, because your readers are probably not native speakers. They will struggle to understand your writing if it's too complicated. And the other thing to mention in this context is, of course, the difference between American English and good old British English. It sounds trivial for me to point this out, but one of the main issues in academic writing, and something that will immediately stand out to an editor and to a peer reviewer, is if you mix up the different usages of English between American and British in a single paper. Check your journal's author guidelines. Often they say, we don't mind if you use British or American, but be consistent. It really stands out if you're spelling words differently throughout the length of your article. There are a number of key differences, even the ways in which tenses are used between the two main forms of academic English. So do keep that in mind. Sounds simplistic for me to mention it today, but it really stands out to editors. They will see this, they will think the paper needs language work, they will send it back to you, they will ask you to get the paper edited by a specialist. And while we're on the subject, don't forget as well that British people like me, if they say something, I only have a few minor comments, they really mean, please write the paper, rewrite the paper completely. It's not bad, means it's good and very interesting, can often be something that you may not want to hear about your academic writing from. Just a bit of fun to throw in there, but decoding the way that British people speak is also important when you look at your reviews, when you look at the kinds of comments that you get back on your paper as part of the peer review process. Moving on quickly to another common area of confusion in academic writing, active versus passive voice. Most journals these days write in their author instructions. Our journals prefer authors to use the active voice. We recommend, when writing your paper, use the active voice where possible. You may have been taught something different, but look at the author instructions for Nature, Wiley, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, the big society publishers. Almost everybody is asking authors, where possible, to write in the active voice. We have incorporated, I collected, our team surveyed, we analyzed. Active voice is easier to understand, and the sentences that you write in the active voice will be shorter. So we'll come back to that in a moment, but just a few more quick issues with academic writing, academic publishing in English, things not to do. Don't start your sentences with these words. Coordinating conjunctions or fragments, we remember them with the acronym fanboys. Don't start sentences with words like for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So don't start your sentences with acronyms. So rather than writing DNA data were collected, we collected DNA data. Active voice removes the acronym from the start of the sentence. Acronyms and abbreviations in academic writing, by the way, conventionally, you always expand those acronyms, those abbreviations, when you use them for the first time in the abstract, as well as for the first time in the main text of the paper. We always, in academic writing, treat the abstract and the rest of the paper as two separate pieces of writing. There are few exceptions, DNA being one. There are a few acronyms in English that we use so commonly that we do not need to expand them. And DNA is one of the few examples. Also, be careful with starting your sentences with numbers. A total of 8 data points is better than 8 data points. Avoiding the use of numbers at the start of sentences. And don't forget that conventionally, numbers 10 and less are written out in full in English academic writing, unless they are associated with units. So numbers up to 10, write them out in full. Numbers 11 and higher go in numerals in your writing. So I caught 10 cats would be written out TEN. I caught 11 cats would be written out with the numbers, with 11. So things to keep in mind, ways to start and not to start your sentences. And I would also encourage you to avoid the use of emotional words in your writing. You can't develop a logical argument using emotion in your writing. We see it a lot in papers written by non-native speakers. A gigantic dinosaur, a fantastic discovery, the amazing potential of land use change in China, for example, to give you some recent examples from my own experience. Words like giant, fantastic, magnificent, earth-shattering, marvelous are informal superlatives. They make your work sound informal. They should be avoided in academic writing if you can. Try not to qualify things that are absolute. Adjectives are often absolute in English. So a Petri dish is either sterile or it's not sterile. It can't be very sterile, quite sterile, or fairly sterile. And an object is unique or it's not. It can't be very unique, quite unique, or fairly unique. So be careful with that, because qualifying absolute adjectives is something that non-native speakers do a lot. They write, this is a very unique conclusion, or this is a fairly unique result. Be careful with that. However, as is always the case, there are some exceptions. You can, of course, be recently pregnant, the adjective, but you can't be slightly pregnant. So care in qualifying your adjectives is also important and something that you need to keep in mind. So just coming up and having a look at some of these other commonly encountered issues with academic English writing, your misplaced modifiers. Using multiple regression techniques, the animals in experiment 1 were. It sounds like the animals were the ones using the multiple regression techniques. In assessing the damage, the plants exhibited numerous lesions. It sounds like the plants were the ones assessing the damage. The spiders were inadvertently discovered while repairing a faulty growth chamber. Who's doing the repairs? The spiders? Be careful. And this is another great example of why it's important to read your work out loud before you finish with the writing. If you read out your papers, if you share your work with others, if you think about and write and read out loud your articles, you will catch these mistakes. Phrases that imply sloppy thinking are also a favorite of mine. It has long been known that usually means that the writer has not bothered to look up the reference. Correct to an order of magnitude usually means that the answer is wrong. Almost reached significance at the 5% level. I've seen this a lot. What does that mean? It means a selective interpretation of data. It's much easier to be understood with simple words and phrases. So use similar rather than analogous. Use rather than utilize, and use end rather than terminate. And just quickly, one of my other personal favorites in word use in English, that or which. Very different, very confusing. These two words can help to make your intended meanings.
That and fit which. Oh, sorry.
These two words can help to make your intended meanings and relationships unmistakable, but think about their use in sentences. If the clause in your sentence can be omitted without leaving the modified noun incomplete, we use which. If we enclose the clause within commas or parentheses, otherwise that. So for example, the lawnmower, which is broken, is in the garage. I can take that middle clause out of the sentence. The lawnmower is in the garage, still makes sense. Which goes in if a clause goes into the sentence, but if the sentence doesn't make sense when the indeterminate clause is removed, then that would be the correct word to use in your English academic writing. And redundancy also, very important, very key issue for people when writing. They often do this. People often do this in their academic writing. You can remove redundant words. Make your sentences shorter, make your sentences easier to understand. That sample is small in size. Delete in size. My box is rectangular in shape. Delete in shape. That man is blue in color. You can delete in color. They're redundant words in academic writing, and we see them a lot, by the way, in different text forms that we edit all of the time. So keeping these issues in mind as a writer will help your English to be more easily understood. So for example, the beaker was filled with water and was then placed on the Bunsen burner is passive voice. It's third person. You can write that more clearly and more effectively. I filled a beaker with water and placed it on the Bunsen burner. The whole length of the highway was paved by the crew. The crew paved the whole length of the highway. These things are critical. They may sound simple, but effective. English academic writing is the first step to high impact factor article submission and publication. I would like to encourage you, if possible, to keep these two things in mind. You can improve your writing. It's a skill, not a talent. You can develop your writing and communication skills. And you can also learn by looking at the papers of other researchers in your field published in English that you like and that you respect, to avoid common mistakes and make sure that your papers have a higher chance of acceptance by making the language clear and simple, attractive to readers, attractive to editors, and to peer reviewers. Keeping in mind that if you have your message, your audience, and your structure as you begin the writing process, you will be much more successful as a writing and publishing academic. At this point, I will quickly give you a recap of what we've talked about in our first session. Apologies for the typo. We have talked about techniques for simple and effective English, writing as you think and then editing, communication skills in English writing, keeping your research writing simple, cognitive bias, commonly encountered English language mistakes, including plagiarism. And I've given you a number of examples of the other kinds of errors that people do tend to make in their writing and in their publishing. We are now, I'm sure you're delighted to hear, going to have a short break, and we will reconvene at the top of the hour in approximately 12 minutes time. So if you're going to take a break, I would encourage you to do that now. We'll leave this slide up and I'll turn off my microphone and my video in just a moment. We will get going again in 12 minutes. But if you're still here and still interested, have a look at this slide. We have an absolutely fantastic digital editing tool at AJE, which is one of the companies within Research Square company. This digital editing AI tool edits papers in less time than it takes me to make a cup of tea. Give it a go in about 6 minutes. You can have one of your papers edited by this AI editing tool. And also, I give you the contact information from my dear friend and colleague, Tomoyuki-san, who is based in Tokyo. He's the sales director for our company. So let's just leave this slide up for a moment. I will put some more information about how to use the tool in the chat box in just a moment. You are, of course, free to ask questions. If you'd like to type a question into the chat box, I'm here, I'm available. I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have at the start of our next session in just a few moments. So see you in 10 minutes, and thank you for your attention so far in our session. 10 minutes, and see you in a moment. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for your attention. I hope you had a nice break. We are now ready to continue with the second of our sessions this afternoon. I hope that in the chat box, our dear colleague will have now pasted for you a Google Drive link, which you can go to. You can click on that Google Drive link and you can download a quick PDF that will explain to you how the AJE digital editing tool works and how it can help you quickly with your papers. So do have a look at that. If you have any further questions or any further follow-up that you'd like, then my dear colleague Tomoyuki-san is here on the slide as well. What we've done is we've set up a free trial for everybody listening to this presentation. You can go in, you can make a number of edits for yourself and see how the tool works. I use it myself almost every day, and it saves hours and hours of time for editing academic articles in English. So do have a look at that. I'll show you that again in a little bit, but we are now ready to move on. And of course, as I said at the beginning of our session today, if you do have any questions, do put them into the chat box. And I see that we have one about the tool. How is AJE superior to other services such as Grammarly? Well, dear sir, do give it a go and see for yourself. It is better or more appropriate than Grammarly for editing academic papers, editing academic research, because the AI that the AJE tool has been trained on has been more than 3 million academic research papers. So Grammarly is great. I also use it for correcting emails, for correcting like more informal pieces of writing, but for correcting academic research papers, you should have a look at the AJE tool. It's really very good, very effective. The answer to your question is that the AI that underlies this AJE tool is academic papers rather than general English writing. We have another question quickly. You said use active tense and showed one example with the first person as the subject. Is it acceptable to use the first person several times? Yes, yes, absolutely. In fact, about 70% of the English text in academic papers, if you do an analysis of academic research articles published in international journals, and I can show you that data at the end of our presentation today, about 70% of your article will be written in the end in the active voice. There are certain places in article writing where the passive voice is used and should be used, but most of your writing, if you can, prefer to use the active voice. That's a great question. It makes your writing shorter. It makes your sentences shorter. It also makes your writing easier to understand. So do have a look at that. I'll share some further examples with everybody at the end, but most journals are encouraging this. Most journals will even say in their author instructions, please use the active voice where possible. It's what Nature, for example, says in its author instructions, the Lancet, the BMJ, the American Chemical Society. So do have a look at that. Any more questions? Don't hesitate. Do feel free to put them in the chat box at any time. We have another one. How was the criterion of accepting a similarity rate of less than 10% set? I feel that when methods and materials are similar, it's not quite easy to meet this criteria. This 10% is just a standard in international publishing. It's what the journals tend to use. But if you're citing other papers, other methods, then you'll never have a problem because you've got your citations in around your method. So if you're using a method, for example, that's been used a lot before in previous research, you don't have to describe that method again in your paper. You can say the methods in this article are based upon previous research and make a number of citations. If you cite carefully what work has been done before, you're never ever going to have a problem with these plagiarism checks. It's when you paraphrase and don't cite, or when you directly take content from another paper and don't cite, such as your own work, where we mentioned self-plagiarism earlier on in our session, that can become an issue. Okay, fantastic. Great questions. I'll move on, I think, but do feel free anytime to put questions and comments into our chat box. We are now going to move on in our second session and talk about strategies for targeting and publishing papers in high impact factor journals. Why is this important? Well, every single month, about 30,000 papers in the medical sciences get published. Around 2 million or so academic articles published every year. How are you going to ensure that your work stands out? How are you going to ensure that your research gets the attention that it deserves? How are you going to ensure that your great message, remember message, audience, that's your target journal and your structure, how are you going to ensure that your great research message gets into the journals that it deserves? That's what we're going to talk about in this session. And having a great article publication, publishing your research in a high impact factor journal starts, as we talked about in our first session today, with journal selection itself. Message, audience, your target journal, and your structure. You are going to be thinking about this before you begin to write, because research and publication is a marriage between your research, your writing, and your journal selection. And you will find that many successful, if not most of the most successful writing and publishing academics, they never start to write until they have decided on a target journal, because every journal is different. They have different aims and scopes. They have different readerships. They publish different kinds of papers. How can you determine where to publish your research for maximum impact? Well, talk to other people, talk to colleagues, talk to editors, and make what we call pre-submission inquiries. We have found that around the world, researchers at universities, they very often spend lots and lots of money and time on collecting data and analyzing data. They often spend lots and lots of time and money writing and editing their papers for publication. But that third part, journal selection, is something that most researchers, many researchers, do not put much time and effort into. They just look to see where their PhD supervisor is publishing, or they quickly make a decision about which journal they're going to use for their next paper. And this is often a mistake. There is no reason whatsoever why you cannot have an idea, a research message, a piece of data, a final piece of research. You know what the outcome is from your experiment, from your piece of research. Then write to editors, make pre-submission inquiries, send emails to editors. In fact, most of the highest impact factor journals want you to do this anyway. They want you to inquire about whether or not your research would be suitable for publication in that journal at the beginning of the process. You are tied to nothing. You can send 50, you can send 20, you can send 100 emails to different editors and say, I finished a piece of research. Would it be suitable for publication in your journal? And they may ignore you. They may say no, or they may say no, but we have another journal in our family that would be appropriate, or they may say, yes, that's a great idea. We would love to see that submitted to our journal. And if that happens, you are already one step further along the road to effective publication in that journal. So make pre-submission inquiries. And when you select journals, when you think about which journal to use for your next paper, it's important to think about impact factor, of course, reputation, of course, reach within your field, and open access. Lots of researchers, they want their papers published in open access journals, but do they understand what that means? We'll talk about that in a moment, but researchers thinking about these different issues will be considering impact factor, reputation, reach within the field, and open access when making a choice about which journal to submit a paper to. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but keep in mind that lots of people do not put much effort into picking a journal, and you should write pre-submission inquiries to get an editor interested in your work before you begin the process. And I will give you 3 rules for journal selection. Aim high. Aim high. Make a list of journals in your field where you would like to see your research published. Aim high. Go for journals with higher impact factors. First of all, you're going to get rejected. Often it happens. That is something that happens to researchers all of the time, unfortunately, but that is nevertheless something that we'll keep in mind. How you deal with rejection, how you move on from rejection is something that is very important in your research career. So aim high, choose appropriately, talk to other researchers, talk to your colleagues, talk to your supervisors, talk to your mentors, finding journals that are appropriate for your research, married to the use of pre-submission inquiries. And that's part of the training that we do provide, that we're here to help with, this learning to sell and manage your article submissions to international journals, because there's some very important steps in communication that you go through in the submission process. But generally speaking, when you talk to authors around the world and ask them what makes a good journal, they say speed. They want their papers published as fast as possible. They want journals with decent impact factors. Of course, your university wants to see you publishing in a journal with a high impact factor. That's how you boost your H-index. That's how your institution, your university, also goes up and up and up in the international rankings. And thirdly, as we discussed before, authors want readership. They want high reach and readership. Of course, that is married to impact factor. The more people read the paper, the higher its impact factor will be. But we need to keep these factors in mind when we choose journals for our writing and publishing, when we start to think about where we will publish our research. And do keep in mind as well that this really is something to think about before you begin that writing process. And my pirate here on the slide, the pirate code for effective journal selection. Aim high. Choose appropriately, and let us help you with training in managing your article submission. This is actually what I'll talk about in our third session today, how you can communicate with editors and peer reviewers to ensure that your submitted article, once it's gone to the journal, once it's been sent out for peer review, has the highest chance of eventual acceptance. But have a look at this checklist as well. 10 steps for journal selection. What's publishable in your field? What's new? What's the most appropriate journal in your field? Is there a time factor? Do you need this paper published by a certain time? What are the characteristics of your target journal? Any general or field-specific requirements? Who should be an author? Very important question. We can come back to that. We can discuss that later if that's of interest. But authorship on academic papers is tied to contributions. Don't give out gift authorships. Don't use writers who are ghost authors. Only people who have contributed to the research, to the writing, to the analysis should be listed as authors on your papers. What to put into the cover letter. Very, very, very important step in publishing, something that people often do not bother with, really, but we will show you how to do this and why writing a great cover letter when you make your submissions to international journals is so, so important. Any trends in publishing that affect your submission? What kind of peer review is your journal, your target journal, going to use? This is important. Will the paper be reviewed blind, or will the reviewer know who you are? Issues in peer review and how you will interpret and respond to peer review comments. I'll talk about that in our third session, but lots of different things to think about when picking a journal and considering making a submission to an international journal. And in terms of open access, 2 different kinds of open access journals are out there. Keep in mind that in the old style of academic publishing, in the days when we used to walk down to the library and actually have a look at the journals that were being released that week, those of you my age will remember when we actually used to do that. Traditional publishing, traditional journal publishing is free to researchers. The cost from publishers is passed to the institution, to the library, in the form of a subscription. So we've all been there. We've tried to download a paper. We can't access it because our university doesn't have that subscription. That's traditional publishing. The cost is borne by the end user, by the university or by the library. In open access publishing, the cost is borne usually by the researcher at the front end of the process, because all of the content, all of the output is free and open to access. So in an open access journal that's fully gold, as it's called, anybody can access your article. Anybody can access your content. Fully open access journals, for example, PLOS, Frontiers, Hindawi, MDPI, Scientific Reports, one of the Nature publishing group journals that's fully open access. These are open to anyone. Talk about this in a little bit more detail, but you are going to be picking with your research which journal to send your paper to. Keep in mind as well that lots of traditional journals are also green open access, in that they allow you, the researcher, to put your finalized draft, your finished submitted draft, not the published version, but the submitted finalized version, onto a website, your own website, or onto a site like ResearchGate, for example. They are green open access in that way. It's a marriage between the different publishing styles, but fundamentally you will be choosing between a traditional journal and an open access journal for your next article. There are different things to think about in that process, but that's the fundamental difference. So when we think about open access publishing, we think about how we have to bring our work to that journal, checking its originality, checking its importance, checking its usefulness, and submitting to any journal. There are important things to think about. The writing style that journal is asking you to use. Are your references relevant and important? And you can evaluate your research when targeting a journal. This comes with experience. As you get more experienced as a researcher, as you move up that tree, up that ladder, up your academic career, you get more experienced as a researcher deciding how significant your work is, and therefore what kinds of journals you can target your research towards. But it's nevertheless useful to think about how you can evaluate your research for publication. How novel is it? Does it have real-world significance? How soon can the findings be applied? What's the potential for changing international practice and policy thinking in your field, and so on? And this is also a very useful checklist for peer review. When your paper goes to a journal, when your paper is sent to a journal and is evaluated by editors and by peer reviewers, these are the kinds of things that they will be thinking about when they evaluate your article as well. So a useful checklist to have, a useful set of things to think about when putting your paper out there into the submission system for a journal, as well as considering which journal to select for your next paper. How novel is it? What's the methodological quality? As we'll talk about in our next session, the method section. Actually, the method section is the #1 area where papers often have issues in the publication process. This is the #1 area of concern for peer reviewers and editors. So you need to make sure that your methods in particular are absolutely bulletproof, absolutely watertight before you submit to an international journal. That's very, very important. So when selecting a journal, when targeting your work to a journal, let's think about our topic area, our audience. Who do we want to be reading the paper, right? Are we writing a review paper that's targeted to other researchers within our specific discipline? That would be one kind of journal. Or are we writing up our original new research and targeting that to higher impact factor journals? What kinds of things are important to you, important to your research? And finding a good target journal is something that I certainly do encourage you to spend time on, keeping in mind these different factors in the publication process. Who are the readers? What's the aim and scope? What kind of article length can you write for that journal? What will be the publication speed? How often does this journal publish articles? Is it publishing every week, like some of the big open access mega journals? Or is it just publishing every year, like annual reviews, for example? What kind of speed? What kind of publication frequency? What's its indexing? Where is it indexed? Its impact factor. Many young researchers, many PhD students around the world are told you must publish in a Scopus Q1 or Q2 journal. Your journal must be indexed in the SCI, for example. This is a requirement for you to get your PhD. So these are important considerations for different researchers. Will it be a traditional journal? Will it be online? Will it be open access? What's the cost to you of publishing in an open access journal? What's the acceptance rate? And keeping these variables in mind, keeping these issues in mind will also help you to evaluate different journals in your field and across the different disciplines within which you work, within which your research team is working, in order to make good decisions. We've heard of impact factors. We've heard of H indexes at the top and at the bottom of these slides. But here are some other ways that journals around the world evaluate themselves. They tell you about these different indexes. The most important one, though, is at the top, the impact factor. Journals get issued with impact factors every 2 years by this company, Clarivate Analytics. And so if a journal that you are considering as an outlet for your next publication tells you that it has an impact factor, it's worth to check, especially if that journal is an open access journal. Check that it's actually listed in the Clarivate database. The impact factor is a measure of the number of citations to articles published over the last 2 years, divided into the total number of articles. So a simple measure of impact, if a journal has, like Nature, for example, an impact factor of 40, that's just a measure of the number of highly cited articles that that journal has published as a measure of all of the articles that the journal has published over the last 2 years. H indices are used to assess individual academics. You may know your H index. If you've got a Google Scholar profile, you can quickly go and have a look at your H index. This is a very, very common way by which researchers are assessed. So when you go for jobs, when you go for postdoc positions, for example, chances are they will look at your H index. If you've got an H index of 2, that means that no matter how many papers you've published, you may have published 20 or 30, the maximum number of citations against the maximum number of papers, I've published 2 papers that have both been cited twice. If you have an H index of 10, you've published at least 10 papers that have been cited 10 times, and so on. It's a measure of your impact. So these are important things to keep in mind when selecting journals, when thinking about journals for your next research article. We've talked about this already. Big issue in academic publishing is cost. Who's going to pay for gold open access? Maybe your university, maybe your institution has a fund that you can use to cover those dreaded article processing charges, those open access publishing fees that these days open access journals are charging. Or traditional journals like Nature and Science are charging if we want our paper to be converted to open access. Keeping that in mind as well is very important, because often, in my experience, researchers don't know about the funding that's available in their own university, in their own library, for example. It's worth to check, because maybe there's a fund that you can use to cover these article processing charges, which are on average about $1,500 for a publication once accepted in an open access journal. Keep this in mind, because in the old days, journals were mostly subscription-based, free for the author. Reader has to pay. As we talked about already, the reader would usually be a library or a university at the end of the process. Open access, free for the reader. That's the whole point of open access. That's the whole point of open research. But the author, the institution, has to pay that article processing charge. These days, most authors would love to see their work published in a high impact factor open access journal. That means they would get lots of recognition for their work from their university. Their funding agency may mandate that they have to publish in an open access journal. But how are they going to cover the cost? Very important consideration if you keep in mind, for example, that the fee for converting a paper accepted in Nature, which is a hybrid journal, it's a traditional journal that also allows you to pay for your papers to be converted to open access, the fee for doing that with a Nature paper is about $10,000. Who has that kind of money? It's becoming a big issue more and more in academic publishing, and something to keep in mind in terms of your journal selection. How can you check that your journal, that your open access journal is reputable? Do have a look at the directory of open access journals. Do have a look there, because you would expect, you would hope that if your open access journal is legitimate, it will be listed in this directory. Also, have a look at this website, publicationethics.org. It's the website of the Committee on Publication Ethics, another great resource to have a look at when selecting a journal for your next submission. DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, publicationethics.org. This is also a place, by the way, where you can find out lots of great information about issues like authorship. Who should be an author on your paper? And find out more information about publication ethics as well. I should mention, by the way, we're actually doing a webinar tomorrow, just 1 hour, on publication ethics. So if anyone would like the link to that, I'd be very happy to share that with you at the end of this session. How to check your open access journal. This, of course, as a model for publishing articles these days, open access publishing, because the author or the institution has to bear the cost, the article processing charge. There are, of course, unfortunately, lots of bad actors in this area now in publishing. We all get lots of emails all the time. Dear Dr. Dyke, dear Gareth, wouldn't you like to contribute to this conference proceedings? Or wouldn't you like to submit a paper to our journal? Very often, predatory journals, no good. They're looking for your money. They offer quick and easy publication. They charge an open access fee at submission. That's a terrible thing. Always keep in mind, is your open access journal listed in the directory of open access journals? If it's not, avoid it at all costs, because they often copy the real name, the fake, and make a fake website. They may not exist. The quality of what they finally publish may be low, and you may end up in a situation where you can't republish your work in a reputable journal. There's a website here that you can have a look at. It's called scientificspam.net. Keep this in mind. The open access publishing model has unfortunately led to quite a number of predatory publishers and predatory journals out there. Another great resource for you, thinkchecksubmit.org. It's a place where you can also get resources to help you determine if the journal that you are selecting for your next paper is reputable or not. Think, is the journal trusted and appropriate? Check. Do you know the journal? Is it a trusted publisher? Does it have clear peer review policies and fees? Never, ever, ever pay anything to a journal at submission. Reputable journals will never charge you anything until your paper is accepted. And then you submit only if it's okay. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, lots of authors do not spend enough time on selecting a journal, and this is very important. Is the publisher reputable? Do you know the publisher? Do they have clear contact details on their site? Who's on the editorial board? Are you familiar with any of those researchers on the editorial board? Don't be afraid to write out emails to members of a journal's editorial board and ask them if they really are working for that journal. Is the journal indexed in databases that you've heard of? Recognize any of the other authors on any of the other papers in that journal? And is the fee structure for open access publishing clearly stated on the journal's website? How to check an open access journal, since many of us do want to get our research published in open access journals these days. thinkchecksubmit.org. So in terms of how you can manage the process, I would recommend that you write to editors at the early stage of article creation. Write to editors. Write to as many as you like. Select a target journal effectively. And I'll give you an email template that you can use to do this after the presentation today. So you can send emails to lots of different journals asking if your work would be suitable for publication in that journal. If you've got a title, if you've got an abstract, then by all means, send that off to the journal at the outset, because before beginning to write, you need your message, you need your audience, and you need your structure ready to share with the journal editor. And also, you will be preparing, as you write your paper, suggestions for suitable peer reviewers. You have a mentorship group, you have a network of international colleagues, other international researchers working in your field. You do know lots of people in your research area around the world. If you stop to think about who you know in different research groups around the world, you will be able to start to think about who you could be suggesting as peer reviewers for your papers. Who do you know? Who have you connected with? Who have you interacted with? Who have you corresponded with in your field around the world? This is your mentorship group, your network of other researchers in your area. Are international colleagues aware of you and your research? Because it is also a great idea when you finish a piece of research to think about your target journal, but also to start to think about who could act as a peer reviewer for that piece of research when you send it to a target journal. So reach out to other international colleagues as well with your research. Why not use preprint servers? Why not consider putting your research onto a preprint server so other people around the world can see it, can interact with it, can learn about you, learn about your research, your career, your reputation will be enhanced. And of course, as well, you will gain people in your network who could be potential journal peer reviewers when the paper goes to an international journal. This is all about impact. Building your international reputation as a researcher is very important, and it's done by not just publishing great research, but also reaching out and interacting with your network of research colleagues around the world as you think about what will maximize your work's scholarly impact, not just after it gets published, when you tweet about it, when you put it on Facebook, when you put it on LinkedIn and send it out in emails to people, but as the research is progressing, how you can talk about your research at early stages as we discuss and think about impact of our research as international research. It's not just where you publish. It's not just where you publish. It's also the difference that your work is making to the lives of ordinary people. Socioeconomic impact as well is something that your university, your government, your research council will be very interested in also measuring and quantifying, because of course, publications are one part of the story. They lie at the heart of impact, academic impact, because we count papers, we look at impact factors, we care about R and H indices, but your research circulation may not necessarily translate to immediate impact. How many people cite your work, but what other things are you doing to ensure that your research reaches the widest possible audience? Of course, impact factor is a very relative concept, and coverage of impact factor listed journals depends upon your research field. As anybody working in the humanities and social sciences will tell you, there are less journals in humanities and social sciences that are listed in international databases and that have impact factors. So it's harder to get work published in journals with impact factors in some subject areas. But there are other things that you can do to disseminate and increase your citation rate, as well as choosing a good journal. Of course, we all care about readership. We all care about citations. We write our papers, as I was discussing in our first session, with our readers in mind. We think about how to write and communicate so that the maximum number of people will cite and use our research. So we are engaged as researchers with the relevant tools. You know about your Web of Science profile, right? You know about your Google Scholar profile, right? You have an ORCID ID, right? Because these are all quick and easy ways to ensure that the maximum number of people around the world know about you and know about your research. So you should have these profiles. You should be talking about your research on the relevant social media channels. You should be thinking about how you design, represent, engage, create early impact, and then reflect and sustain that impact throughout the life cycle of a research project, not just a research publication. Don't be like me. Don't do what I used to do. Wait for a paper to get published and then maybe do a bit of social media and a bit of blogging. Talk about your research all of the time. Build a profile, design, represent, engage, build early impact around the research that you are doing, around the projects that you're working on. So when it comes time to make submissions to journals, people know about you and they know that you're a good researcher, because of course there are a number of different pathways to impact. You could write papers about the molecular genetics of tobacco and publish them in very specific subject area journals. Or you could write papers about the molecular genetics of tobacco and think about the bigger picture, the health implications, the global economic implications. And that's the key to getting your work targeted into higher impact factor journals, thinking about the bigger picture, not just focusing your research on the actual details of the research itself, but thinking as you write about the bigger picture of your study and thinking through your impact during the project, on publication and post-publication. Are you making videos? Are you talking about your research? Are you writing about your research? Are you putting outputs online, building that body of content around your research, in addition to those high impact factor publications? Knowing about your channels, knowing about where people read about your research is very dependent upon where you are in the world, of course. WeChat, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, but putting content on these channels and talking about your research is very, very, very important. Your research impact is a journey. It's not just the final publication. do have a look at this slide. Do use this slide because it's a great thing to have in grant applications. It's a fantastic thing to put into project descriptions, for example, because it shows that you are considering different stages of the research cycle: inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, all through the lifespan of a research project. Too many researchers just think about journal publications. They just think about getting maximum impact factor for their journal publications. That's important, of course, but there are many, many things that you can also do to talk about your research as you assess your impact. How great would it be if the next time you have a job application or a grant application, you're able to tell people how many times your paper was shared, how many times it was mentioned, how many times it was viewed or downloaded, something about press coverage. All of these measures for immediate impact. Altimetrics, for example, does a lot of this for us, Altimetrics, but you can collect these kinds of data as well yourself. So you are in the position to put your paper together, and your article structure is important. Your paper has two distinct sections, a title and an abstract, which are the windows into your research for other people and the rest of the study. Your title and your abstract are so important. Making sure that you have an effective title, making sure that you have an effective abstract so people can see immediately the impact of your research. So writing a good title is very important. Keep it short. Adequately describe the contents of the paper, identify the main issue, begin with the subject, be accurate, unambiguous, specific, and complete. Do not use infrequently encountered abbreviations, and attract people's attention. Above all, you want people to think, that's a really interesting topic. I want to read more. Attract their attention. Keep it short, keep it simple, make it compelling, concise and informative. The most important words related to the topic, enticing your reader without giving away the punchline, and make sure that people want to read your study. In terms of your abstract, honest and precise, has to stand alone. No technical jargon, short and specific, and keep in mind that your editor may only read your title and your abstract. They may only read these parts of the study before making a decision about whether or not to send it out for peer review. It's all that lots of people will read of your study. So make it count. Put time into your abstract. Don't write it in a rush at the end of the process. It's got to accurately reflect the full text of the paper. You can write an effective abstract very, very well using 4 basic questions, using the 4 basic questions at the bottom of this slide. Why did you do the study? What did you do? What did you conclude? And what did you find? If you answer those 4 questions as the basis for your abstract, you will be in great shape, because structure is everything. Message, audience, and structure, very, very important to have these in mind as you begin the writing process. My job today, this afternoon, and hopefully in future sessions will be to help you prepare to write, to get into the right mindset for academic writing, the right topic, the right audience, identifying your purpose, and gather supporting details. We can provide you, if you would like us to come back in the future and do more of these kinds of trainings, with preparation techniques, with ways to sell yourself to journals. That's what I'll talk about in our last session after the next break, about structure and about effective writing. So In our second session, we've talked about message, audience, and structure, journal selection, making pre-submission inquiries, and how to avoid predatory journals. I've talked a little bit about open access versus traditional journals, and we'll talk after the break about submitting and managing the publication process. So thank you so much for listening to this session. We will have a short 10-minute break. Let me have a quick look at the Q&A. We've got some questions from our first session that we'll have a look at. So do take a break if you're joining us and you'd like to take a break, because we'll be starting again with content in about 10 minutes. At the top of the hour, I have quite a number of questions in the Q&A box. Avoid emotional words, our colleague is asking. How about using surprisingly to emphasize our findings? Yeah, this is an example of a word that we recommend that you don't use, surprisingly. Is it really that surprising? What about notably? Or what about importantly? Or what about noteworthy? Or words like that rather than surprisingly, because that implies that the result actually took you by surprise. That's a great question. That's a good question. We may plan and structure a paper in advance, but a desk rejection sends us back to square one. That's a great question. Indeed. What I recommend that you do in this situation, of course, to avoid the amount of time that you might have to spend reformatting papers in the future, is selecting journals that have similar formatting requirements to other ones. So, for example, I used to send a lot of papers to Proceedings of the Royal Society. And then if they got rejected, I had a second journal, Journal of Evolutionary Biology, that was very similar in its formatting requirements to that original target journal. But yes, formatting is an issue, and going back to square one can be an issue. But if your message is strong, your article is well written, limited amount of reformatting. But I do think that having message initially in place for the article writing is a strong approach to help you get the paper into that target journal. But that's something that we should pick up on and talk about in more detail. About pre-submission inquiries, how much detail should we write about in a pre-submission inquiry? Is it like a cover letter or more details? Yeah, you need to keep your pre-submission inquiries short and simple, but above all, telling the editor why your paper is a good choice for their journal. I think that's the most important thing. I know that's the most important thing. Editors want to hear about their journal. So my research shows X, Y, and Z. It is a great fit for your journal because you've recently published other similar papers. Your readership is X, Y, and Z. So not too much detail, but the main pieces of significance and why that paper is a good fit for that particular target journal. I'll give you a template for this. We'll circulate an email template at the end of this session so you can have a look at that for simple things to put into a cover letter, a pre-submission inquiry, I should say. Getting your message across is more important than being correct. In terms of grammatical correctness, in terms of strict grammatical correctness, often that can be the case, that if you're writing in the first person, in the active voice, a simple message is more important than the grammatical correctness of the presentation, if that makes sense. I hope that answers that, but I'll give you some further examples of that in follow-up from this session. But no, I mean, satisfying grammatical correctness is not a good idea, but sometimes in some specific situations, you may end up with a clearer message written in the active voice that transmits your academic content more effectively and clearly. Yeah, if you fail Nature, then you try Nature Communications or Scientific Reports or Nature Medicine. These are manuscript transfer systems. So you submit a paper to Nature, it gets rejected, but you get good comments back or valuable comments back. You can then transfer those peer reviews within the system, within the Nature manuscript transfer system, to another member of that journal family. And that's what other publishers do as well. So very often, yeah, I would follow that strategy. Nature Communications, Scientific Reports was a track that we went through with lots of our papers, for example. So yeah, that's a good question. Taking that approach, allowing the publisher to transfer the paper directly, transfer the peer reviews directly, is a way to expedite the publication process. So great question. Please explain the clear difference between a cover letter and a pre-submission inquiry. A cover letter contains additional information to a pre-submission inquiry. A cover letter tells the editor why the paper is important, why the paper is a good fit for that journal, and should also include suggestions for peer reviewers. We'll talk about that in our next session. A pre-submission inquiry, you will be sending to a number of different journals, so you have to change it when you send it to a number of different journals. And into that pre-submission inquiry, I would suggest that you include more information about the results of the study, maybe the title, maybe the abstract, in order to convince an editor who hasn't yet received the paper for submission that they should receive that paper for submission. So that's, I think, the difference between those two, and I'll give you templates for both of those at the end of this session. Another question: there is an increasing pushback on impact factor as a sound measure of impact. The advice is to reduce the emphasis on quantitative results. There's a rethinking of the reward and recognition system. Yeah, I think that's great. My view on that is that that's very, very welcome and well past time. And I would like that this was the case in more countries. And I think it's great that this is the case in Japan, potentially, and because reviewers should be recognized based on more than just the impact factor of the journals that they publish in. So in the UK, for example, the research assessment exercises look not just at the publication journal quality, but also at other measurable impact metrics of the research itself. So you've got to put together an impact statement. You've got to tell the funding agency, hey, I published a Nature paper, but this is the other things that publication also enabled, the other areas of impact that publication also enabled. Is it possible to send a pre-submission inquiry to any journal? Yes, you can send as many as you like. You can send as many as you want to as many journals as you like. I could not find a web page explaining about it in my favorite journal. Well, find the email of the editor. You may know the email of the editor already. Just write them an email. They love it if you contact them and reach out to them and say, hey, Dr. DYKE, editor of this journal, I've got a paper, a piece of research finished. It shows X, Y, and Z. You've previously published X, Y, and Z papers in your journal on similar topics. Would this be a suitable candidate for submission to your journal? And chances are they'll say yes. If you get a yes back after a pre-submission inquiry, then you're already inside the mind of the editor. You're already one step closer towards publication. I'm just going to answer quickly one more question before just taking a 1-minute break before our next session starts. What's my take on borderline predatory journals? Well, in my opinion, a journal is either predatory, reputable, or not. Predatory or reputable. There's no borderline. Some OA journals are on the DOAJ list and appear legit now. Right, but senior researchers consider them as predatory journals. This is a matter of discussion, as you say, amongst collaborators. Journals like MDPI, even scientific reports back in the day was considered predatory by some lists. MDPI, another good example. So publishers build their reputations, journals build their reputations, and there's no reason why an open access journal that started can't grow into a very reputable open access journal. Hindawi, MDPI, Frontiers, PLOS are good examples of this. And so, yeah, it's a matter of discussion amongst colleagues and collaborators, but have a look at who else is publishing in that journal, the quality of the papers. Are they being cited? Are they being used? Very, very, very important. And that's a great question. Thank you for that great question. We have a question about preprint servers. Is the priority of the experimental data secured, and how is authorship guaranteed? It's absolutely 100% secured, because every preprint that's published on a preprint server is assigned a DOI, a document object identifier number, and all of the content in that preprint server is protected by a Creative Commons, a CC license. So if I preprinted an article right now on Research Square or on bioRxiv, for example, my priority is immediately protected. That becomes my work. It's documented and protected by a document object identifier number, no different to when papers get published in full peer-reviewed journals. So actually, you're much safer preprinting than not preprinting, because if you go to a conference or talk about your research online and you haven't preprinted, there's nothing to stop somebody else from taking that and publishing it themselves. So preprinting is actually a really good idea to protect your experimental data and guarantee authorship. And I hope that answers your question. Thank you for it. If okay, I'll just take a quick 1-minute break and we'll get started with the next session of our presentation. I'll encourage you just to have a look at this slide. If you haven't had the chance to have a look at our digital editing tool, do have a look at that in the few minutes that we have remaining before we get started with our next session. All right, let's get started again with the third session of our presentation today. We have a comment in the chat box, in the Q&A box, about MDPI open access journals and scientific reports. Yeah, I mean, opinions vary about open access journals. Opinions vary wildly about open access journals. And often the quality of peer review is the big issue here. As you've correctly identified, the quality of peer review, if you're publishing lots and lots and lots of papers all of the time, as is the case with some of these big mega publishers like MDPI, it's now the biggest open access publisher, I think, in the world. It's very, very fast growing, very rapidly growing. And yeah, how do they maintain peer review quality? That's a big issue, I think. So thank you so much for that question. Thank you for all of the questions, everybody. We're getting some great questions in our session today. We'll take some more time at the end of this third session to talk more and to answer any more of your questions. Do feel absolutely free to put your questions into the chat box, into the Q&A panel. We're continuing now with session number 3. What have we talked about so far? We talked about common academic writing mistakes, issues in academic writing and academic publishing and communication skills. We talked about impact and targeting and publishing papers in high impact factor journals. In our third session, starting now, we are going to talk about managing the publication process. What happens when you make a submission to an international journal and how you can manage that process. So I like to call this the academic publishing hamster wheel. You go round and around and around this cycle all of the time. You may have several different papers at different stages of this publishing cycle at the moment. Who knows? Ideas, funding, data collection, journal selection, paper writing, submission, peer review, and publication. You go round and around and around this academic cycle all of the time. How you manage the different stages of this publishing cycle will seriously, significantly impact your publications. And I see a question, open access and peer review quality are unrelated unless I can be shown differently. Incentives or profits for reviewers are the same for open or closed outlets. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit later on in our session, because what a lot of open access journals do actually is they pass the peer review to guest editors, or they pass the peer review to people managing the journal on a short-term basis as a guest editor. If you go and have a look at how publishers like MDPI put out so much content, they're publishing guest edited special issues, for example, in particular thematic areas. And to do that, they invite guest editors to manage the journal, and those guest editors get to manage the peer review process. And that's where issues come in peer review quality in a lot of those open access publishers. So that's a great comment, George. Let's come back to that and talk about that at the end of the session. Generally speaking, I think you're absolutely right that open access and peer review quality are unrelated, but in some open access publishing models, peer review quality has been compromised for speed and for the amount of content. Back to the hamster wheel, in terms of academic publishing and the academic publishing cycle, as I mentioned already, we all spend a lot of time going around and around the cycle. And you saw this letter at the beginning of our presentation earlier, how to get through the initial desk rejection of academic papers. Because as George mentioned in one of his questions as well, often our papers get desk rejected before they get sent out for peer review. And one of the keys to understanding how this process works is actually thinking about the kind of person that you are interacting with at an academic journal. Different kinds of editors manage the process at different stages. As our first step to understanding how to communicate with editors, who are you talking to? A journal managing editor you would almost never interact with, because they are managing groups of journals, they're managing portfolios of journals, and they won't get involved in the day-to-day management of content. They won't get involved in the day-to-day management of the peer review process. Similarly, a language editor working on the English content in an article is not the person who will be making decisions about what should and should not happen to a paper once it goes to a journal for submission. You are interacting with an editor-in-chief or an editorial office at the initial stages of manuscript submission. So having gone through the pre-submission process and gotten the green light from an editor to make a submission, the next stage, the next important part of communication is putting your submission into the system effectively at the outset. And this is why journal selection is so important, because if you just submit at random to journals, you have a much lower chance of successfully passing into the peer review process. Keep in mind that at higher impact factor journals, rejection rates, desk rejection rates are very, very high. So 80%, 90% of submissions to a journal like Nature will not make it out for peer review. We used to have parties when we got that email back from Nature saying, your paper has been selected for peer review. It's a big step forward towards the publishing success, at the end of the day. So keeping that in mind, targeting, as we've been talking about in our second session, your message to international journals is very important. Pre-submission inquiries then, journal selection, you can use this to be effective and save time. Rank journals, choose appropriately, and there's no limit, as we talked about before, to the number of pre-submission inquiries that you can make to different journals. Write to editors. Write to as many as you would like. This will help you to select a target journal effectively. And if you have your abstract and you have your title ready to go, send those to the editor as part of that initial pre-submission inquiry stage. If you end up submitting a paper or thinking about submitting a paper to Nature, to Science, for example, they will ask you at the outset to make a pre-submission inquiry before making a full submission. So think about doing that. It's very important. Dear editor, we are considering submitting a manuscript to your journal that is currently titled, I have included the working abstract of our article below. Our study identifies, we have been able to show. We therefore feel that our paper should be of interest to the readership of your journal. I'm writing to make a pre-submission inquiry because I am an active researcher and therefore need to ensure that my paper is reviewed and hopefully published as fast as possible. Would it be possible for you to tell me whether or not you are interested in receiving this submission for consideration? Save time. Get an editor lined up before you make your submission. This is the first stage in effective communication as part of that wheel, the publication cycle that we talked about earlier. If you make submissions blind to journals, you are wasting time because the paper may come back desk rejected, but that might take a long time. So making pre-submission inquiries at the outset, getting your research into the mind of editors at the outset is a very good strategy. You've nothing to lose. You can write to a number of target journals. You will be able to get a paper ready in the mind of an editor at the start of the process. And of course, as our colleague was asking in the Q&A during the break just now, another way to showcase your research, to put it out there, is putting it onto a preprint server. What are these? Well, they're online repositories for academic research. You put your draft onto a preprint server before peer review and before publication, obviously. You may have a journal in mind, or you may not. Lots of journals, when articles get submitted through their online systems, preprint those articles by default. Springer Nature, for example, when you make a submission to any of the Springer Nature journals, you will be given the option in the submission process to preprint on Research Square or not. You can say no, or you can say yes. In many cases, many of these journals will encourage you to do that because corrections from the community can significantly improve your article quality. So advantages of preprinting: your work gets shared fast with the community. Peer review can happen in an open way on the preprint platform. People will make comments about your paper on the preprint platform. And also, in many cases, if you preprint without having a target journal in mind, journal editors will come to you. They'll contact you and they'll say, hey, Dr. Dyke, we've seen that you've preprinted a paper about X, Y, and Z. Would you like to consider this for publication in our journal? So this is another great way to get your research out there into the wider research community before peer review and before publication. In the old style of publishing, we'd submit to a journal, we'd wait for months and months and months for comments to come back, then we'd respond to review comments, we'd make those corrections, the paper would finally be published in the journal, and that's a long time to wait to learn about the new results of a colleague, for example. And as we were asked in the Q&A, your priority, your content, your author intellectual property on preprint servers are protected by Creative Commons licenses. So don't worry about using them. You're actually better protected if you do than if you don't. So that is also something that's well worth thinking about. Your author concerns are addressed. You are protected if you preprint on a preprint platform by Creative Commons licenses and document object identifier numbers. Journals select from preprint servers and you get quick access to open peer review. I can give you a guide to preprint servers after the webinar as well. A pre-submission inquiry template, a guide to preprint servers, and a cover letter template I will pass on to the organizers so that they can be passed on to you if you're listening to this. Because this is what we're aiming for. We're trying to get through the first stage of article submission, desk rejection, as George was asking about earlier in the Q&A. It's something that we have to think about when we make our submissions. It's just like getting hit by a bus. Go outside, get hit by a bus, you get rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, the first thing that happens is that the doctors at the hospital, they decide what is going to happen next. It's called triage, and it's the same in journal publishing as well. Criteria which desk editors consider when they think about your paper. They think, does it fit with the journal scope? Does the article have a clear message? Is it original? Is it important? Is it true? And is it relevant to our readers? Very important. Readers, as we talked about in our first session today, are the most important people in academic writing and publishing. Think about your readers when writing your articles. Very, very, very important. And of course, you've got to sell yourself to get your paper through triage. High impact factor journals want to maintain high rejection rates, as we've talked about. So how you do this, how you sell yourself at the earliest stages of publishing are very important before you even get your paper out for peer review. Pre-submission inquiries, pre-printing, and good cover letters when you submit your articles to journals. Now, what's a cover letter? Well, it's absolutely critical to have a good cover letter when sending one of your research papers to a journal. Don't waste the opportunity to sell your work. Don't write something boring. Don't write something dull or derivative. Please consider this manuscript for publication in your esteemed journal. It's boring. Tell the editor why they should take your work seriously. I've been an editor for almost 20 years at international journals, and this is the most common kind of cover letter. We get this a lot. Nothing. Authors make submissions to our journal. They don't bother to put a cover letter into the submission at all. They think something magic is going to happen. They don't give us the editorial team the information that we need to assess the paper. They don't tell us anything about why the paper is important, useful, and interesting to the readers of our journal. And we care about our journal's reputation. We care about our journal's readership. This is what people often write as well. Please find our paper enclosed, which we hope you will find interesting. Yours sincerely, Gareth DYKE. It's also a waste of time. No information in here that tells the editor anything about the paper. You have the opportunity at this stage of the process to sell your work to a journal, to tell the editor, the editorial team, why the paper is important and interesting, and also to give them some suggestions for suitable peer reviewers. Don't miss this opportunity. Very, very, very important. Who are your peer review suggestions? How do you get them? Well, we talked earlier about your network, about your international network, about colleagues that you interact with around the world working in your research area. Who can you suggest in your cover letter who would be suitable to act as a peer reviewer? We made this example up, but it is selling the work to the journal. Compound X is a powerful anti-cancer agent. It was synthesized at 99% yield. Reactions catalyzed by A are 60% faster. Our method for protein synthesis gives 50% higher yield. It tells the editor the message. It tells the editor why the paper is important. It captures the editor's attention. It makes processing the paper easier for the editor because you've got peer reviewers in there as well. It's very important to do this because you are going to be maximizing your article's chances of success. This is, of course, one of the first sections of the paper that the editor's going to read, and so you have to make it count. Why is the topic important? Why are the results significant? What's the key result, the breakthrough, the message? Remember the message of your paper? What's the message? Why is this an advance on previous work? Why this journal? Why are you submitting to this journal? And don't forget to provide those peer reviewer suggestions as well. If you get rejected and you end up submitting to another journal, edit your cover letter. We get lots of submissions to our journal where the authors have not bothered to change the cover letter. It still says Nature or it still says Science in the cover letter. So keep that in mind. These small differences, small things that you can do, make a big difference to editors. They make a big difference to how editors feel about your research. But doing a great cover letter at the start of the process is very important. I'll give you a template for this as well, but I'm submitting an original paper for publication. My study is important because we believe it will be important to the wider readership of your journal. We're excited about this journal. The following individuals would be appropriate as potential referees of this work. Very important cover letters, initial stages again of communication as you put your paper into the submission process, as we go around and around the good old hamster wheel of academic publishing from one stage to the next. What happens next after submission? Pre-submission inquiries, journal selection, submission to the journal. Of course, you then sit back and wait for peer review comments to come back. How long should you wait? Well, that's a good question and a very commonly asked question. Generally speaking, it takes about 6 to 8 weeks for a journal to get comments back from peer reviewers. So I would say if you've waited longer than 6 to 8 weeks for peer review comments to come back, it's time to write a polite email to the editor and inquire about the status of your paper. When the comments come back, here are some tips for responding to those comments. Once reviewed, you're either going to get rejected, let's hope not, or you're going to get major or comprehensive revisions or minor revisions that you have to make to your paper. Very important to be polite, to be comprehensive, and to show the editor that you take this process seriously. If you write short responses, I made all the changes requested, or I've done everything, that's going to not make the editor feel like you have done enough to warrant publication. So once reviewed, the comments come back. The way that you handle, the way that you respond to these comments will determine your paper's chances of eventual acceptance. Show the editor that you take this process seriously. Make sure editors and peer reviewers feel good about your responses. If they feel good about your responses to their comments, they will give your article a positive review. It's going to be more likely to get accepted. Now, this is important because lots of authors are rude in their comments to peer reviewers, or they're rude or negative when they write back to the editor. You can do this. You can do this. I would like to thank the reviewers for their time and energy. The reviewer has correctly pointed out, I acknowledge this comment. I concur with the reviewer. Thank you for the valuable comments. The valuable comment is much appreciated. If you write that, then the peer reviewers, when they see your responses, which they probably will, they're going to think, ah, I made a valuable comment, or I did spend lots of my valuable time on this. Thank you to the author for acknowledging that. Don't be negative. Don't be aggressive. I do not think the reviewers understand my point. It would not be necessary to change this. We simply do not have the data. These are negative responses to peer review. They will put the editor, the peer reviewers, into a negative mindset. They will decrease your chances of positive acceptance, of a positive outcome at the end of the process. And it's very important. Who reviewed my paper? I need to know. The comments I received were unfair and just plain wrong. Who wrote this about my article? Please write me immediately. These are real comments that I received from an author after peer review on their article, and it's not an effective way to respond to comments received in peer review. And often, actually, reviewers like to hide their identities from authors because they don't want any negative feedback. And journals may want this too. They often use blinded peer review. Very commonly, journals use what we call single blind peer review, where the author doesn't know who the peer reviewers are, but the peer reviewers know who the authors are. Okay, so editors may offer this to reviewers in order to get more positive comments, to get more comprehensive comments back on a paper. So it's important as an author to be polite, to be comprehensive, to show that you're taking the process seriously, but also to be calm and to write things in your response document that show that you appreciate the time that the editors and peer reviewers have taken on your paper. You can check which kinds of peer review are used by different journals. You can select journals, for example, that use double-blind peer review if you feel that that would be fairer for your paper, which would work best for you. And many authors prefer, for this reason, to use preprint servers and open peer review systems so that everything is open and everything is transparent. Nobody can hide behind anonymity, whereas authors in other parts of the world, in India, in China, for example, they prefer to use double-blind peer review because they feel that there's bias in the system towards colleagues from particular regions. So it's a personal choice what kind of peer review you select, but managing peer review as a communication step in the publication process is.
Your microphone is on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't know how much you missed.
No, it
there.
was just the last 5 seconds or so.
Okay, excuse me. Sorry.
No problem.
So I recommend that you do create a comprehensive document in response to the comments that you receive in peer review, because effectively responding to those comments is very important. So an executive summary, an editorial summary at the top of the document, where you tell the editor overall what you did in response to the comments that you received. We would like to thank the 2 reviewers who worked on our paper for their considerable efforts and for the time they devoted to our work. We have made almost all the changes requested and enclose a response document with the changes highlighted in red, and you make it clear to the editor which changes you made and where. So comment and response, comment and response. So even the small issues, even the little issues, please use American English spelling. Thank you for this editorial comment. We have corrected our paper throughout. By making even comments on small changes, you show the editor and the editorial office that you're taking this process seriously, that everything that you can do to speed up the process, you have done. A comprehensive document, effectively responding to review comments, make it thorough and show the editor that you have taken this process seriously. And you put an effective cover letter back into the system with your responses to peer review. I'd like to thank the reviewers. We appreciate their comments. We've accepted almost all the changes. We've provided substantial citation-based explanations as to why we have not made some of those changes, communicating what you did in an effective way. So, pre-submission inquiries, journal selection, cover letters and that submission stage, and then into your responses to comments that you receive during the peer review process. By the way, all of this, it's just a taster. It's just an overview in this series of sessions of the training, the more comprehensive training that we could, of course, provide to your institution, to your organization, to your consortia in the future. This is a very short version of peer review training. We have a lot more and we'll be delighted to come back and provide further training in this area in the future if appropriate. We've now gotten our paper back from peer review, but we're concerned about the time that it is taking. Dear editor, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm writing in regard to my article. It's been reviewed and I've received minor revisions. 3 of the 4 reviewers recommended acceptance and 1 asked again for small changes. It's important to communicate with the editor at all of these different stages if you have any concerns, if your paper's taking too long, if you feel that the referees are moving the goalposts, for example, if things are happening in the process that you do not think are fair, talk to the editor. Very, very important, because their job, the editor, is to monitor the process and act as an adjudicator in all of these different situations. So you should get used to communicating with editors, talking to editors as much as possible. And what happens if your paper gets rejected? Now, this happens a lot, of course. It happens to all of us all of the time. In academic research, I reckon that we get rejected almost more often than any other line of work that we could have. Perhaps only salespeople, only people working, selling things get rejected more often. But often, unfortunately, in academic research, in publishing, in international journals, you're going to get rejected and you're going to feel that that was unfair. It happens often. What to do? If you genuinely think that your research is important, well done, and does deserve to reach that journal's audience, and you've gotten unfair reviews, we recommend writing an appeal letter to the journal editor. What's the worst that can happen? The paper has already been rejected by Nature, by Science, by Nature Communications. If you feel you've been unfairly treated, it's always worth communicating that to the editor, because they might change their mind. And of course, what's the worst that can happen if the paper has already been rejected? The worst that can happen is that it stays rejected. So consider doing this if you can. I find around the world, in different areas, in different regions, the reaction of researchers to rejection is quite different. Some people feel very dejected when they get rejected. They move on immediately to another journal. Some people feel, how could they have rejected my brilliant research? And they feel much confident. They feel much more confident. They feel much better about writing to an editor. But there are going to be clear situations in your career where you are unfairly treated. And the way that you manage this is one of the keys to your success as an international researcher. I have two examples from my own career. One paper that we submitted to Nature Communications got really bad reviews, terrible reviews. We felt that those reviews were unfair, unduly aggressive, and that they didn't focus appropriately on the science. So we wrote to the editor after the paper had been rejected, and we pointed this out. The editor said, sure, and sent the paper off for more reviews. In the end, it got accepted. The same thing happened with this paper I published in Nature. One of the reviewers, we felt, did not understand the method that we'd used. The paper had been rejected, but the comments that we got about one of the methods were inaccurate. So we wrote to the editor to explain that. We asked the editor for additional reviews. The editor agreed. The paper got sent out again for peer review, and it got accepted. Don't just take it. If you feel you've been unfairly treated in peer review, or you get comments back that you feel are not appropriate or not fair, you must appeal, you must write to the editor, because they may change their mind. Don't miss out on high impact factor publications that could change the course of your career. How you react in these situations is very, very important. It's actually key to your success. And indeed, there are other things that you should at the same time avoid trying to do at the final stages of article submission. For example, very commonly happens that once a paper gets accepted, or authors can see that a paper is about to be accepted because the peer review comments have come back and they're positive, they start adding authors. Dear editor, thank you for reviewing my manuscript during your busy schedule. I've made some modifications and I've added 2 authors. They also contributed to my manuscript. This is not okay. Sending a paper to a journal requires that at the outset, at the submission, all authors are on that paper. They all know about that submission and they all support that submission. Do not try to add authors late in the process. Trying to add authors after acceptance is the worst, and it raises lots and lots of red flags at journals. You're going to have to complete a lot of paperwork to make that happen. All of the other authors on a paper will have to agree to that change in the authorship. Don't try to do it. It's unethical, but it's something else that authors often try to do at the end of the process. In terms of communication, once your paper is accepted, you're almost always going to get a final chance to make changes, the proof stage, as it used to be called in article publishing. At this stage, make minor corrections, clear comments, unambiguous, keeping those changes to a minimum, because often journals charge you if you want to make big changes to papers at this final stage. If they judge that your changes are too extensive, they may send the paper out for peer review again, or they may even reject it if you're trying to make too many changes at the post peer review stage. Have your software updated. You'll be given a short deadline, which you must stick to. Only make 100% necessary changes, and do not try to make authorship changes at this stage, because that's going to be a problem for the journal. That's going to require signed permissions from all current authors. We actually get lots of communication from authors about their figures. At the end of the process, authors get all upset about their figures. It's not big enough, it's not colorful enough, it's not in the right position in the paper. Don't panic. These are easy changes to make by the production teams, who are, by the way, often not the same people who edited the paper and sent it for peer review. A quick, polite email to the editor will get the issue fixed as fast as possible. And you will need to have all of the information necessary at that final submission stage. Checking the editorial policies, authorship, research integrity, translations, plagiarism, image manipulation, any conflicts of interest, any bioethics statements. Have a look at the author guidelines in your target journal at the final stages of publication to make sure that you have not missed anything off the process. And do get yourself an ORCID ID. As we talked about in our previous session, this is one great way to raise your international profile, to make sure that other research colleagues around the world know about you and know about your research. It's easy. This is a not-for-profit organization that provides you with this persistent identifier. So people will be able to quickly find out about you and about your research. ORCID is becoming more and more a requirement for submitting international publications to journals. But again, we're here to help if you have any questions. Communication is key. Writing and dealing with editors is very important. Hi, where's my paper? I waited 2 months. Looking forward to an immediate reply is a real example of a bad email. Here's a good one. Dear editor, I'm writing to ask if I can do something to help smooth my recent submission to your journal. Can I make some suggestions for additional peer reviewers? Polite, effective, helpful communication with journal editors will actually significantly enhance your article's chances of acceptance. And all of this, all of our training, all of the content that we've talked about today, communication, writing and publishing, managing your message, selecting a target journal, dealing and communicating over the course of the publication process has the goal of helping you maximize your publication success. Be the best that you can be. Get your papers published in the best journals possible to enhance your career. communication is very important. If you have any questions, we're coming to our Q&A in a moment. Do put your questions and comments in the Q&A or in the chat box, or feel free to reach out to me at any time after this session. We are here to help you to move your excellent research smoothly into international journals, to maximize your career, to move quickly and effectively around the publication cycle. It's important to understand the process, and I hope that in these training sessions today, I've been able to pass on a little bit of information to help you with that process. In this third session, we've talked about reviewers. We've talked about ensuring that your work has the highest chance of publication, communication with editors, writing a cover letter, how to manage peer review, and how to deal with comments and survive rejection. As I mentioned before, all of this is a very short, very concise, very concentrated snapshot of the kind of training that we can provide in our Nature Masterclasses online, for example, and in other training that we have at Springer Nature. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation today. Do not forget, I invite you to have a look at our AJE digital editing tool. You can download it from the link that is in the chat box. If you scroll up through the chat box, there's also a link to our PDF, which explains how to manage this whole process. And my colleague, Tomoyuki-san, his contact details are here as well on the slide. So do take note of his email address. Do get in touch with him at any time if you'd like to learn more about me. My name's Gareth DYKE. Our company is Research Square, which is part of Springer Nature. And at this point, I think we will hand over to George. George, do you want to jump in at this stage? And I'll invite people as well to put questions and comments and feedback into the chat box. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation today. George?
Gareth, well, thank you, first of all, for leading such an interesting session. As you could tell, I was engaging in it myself, as I also dropped a couple of questions of my own. I found your session extremely interesting and, very importantly, I think very practical, because you provided very specific advices and even templates of documents that researchers can try to use straight away to improve the way they communicate and how they reach out to editors and journals. And I really think it's very useful, very practical, in a practical sense useful. So I hope it will have a big impact next to those who followed through this session. I will give it still a couple of minutes to see if you receive some comments or questions in the chat. And in the meanwhile, I have one opinion that I would like to share with you to see what you think, but I also have one question. And I will start with that one, waiting to see if someone else also has more questions for you. And what I would like to ask you is to perhaps provide some specific tips on how would you say researchers can write down how to refuse to implement specific suggestions or requests from reviewers. So you say, of course, we know we should accommodate and we should address comments as much as possible, but sometimes we are not really willing to, because either we are completely against it, or it would end up us writing a completely different paper. How would you say politely, how can we say no to a reviewer in a letter?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, often we get comments in peer review that we don't want to address, that we don't feel we need to address, or that we actually disagree with? Yeah, so the first thing to say about this is that if you can, it's a good idea to make as many changes as possible to your paper after peer review, but there will be things that you do not want to change. Keep in mind that if I get asked to peer review a paper, or you get asked to peer review a paper, you can say anything that you want. You can write down your opinion, you can make remarks about the paper that do not have to be supported by any evidence as a peer reviewer. But as an author, as a researcher responding to those comments, you've got to convince the editor that you have the correct opinion, that your opinion is worth listening to. So you need evidence if you're not going to do something when comments come back in peer review. And that should be relatively straightforward for you if the review comment is actually incorrect, or if the review comment is not relevant to the research. You can support your refusal to make that change with some citations is the best thing to do, but do it in a polite way. Don't say, I refuse to make this change. Say, the following papers recently published in the area show that this change is not necessary, or this would remove the scope of the study. So use evidence to support your argument. The editor will be on your side if you make a convincing argument. So that would be my advice in that situation. The editor is there to adjudicate between you, the author, and the peer reviewers. Okay, so if you make a convincing case, you will be in a good situation, in good shape to not have to make that particular change. Okay.
Yeah, that's very clear. Well, and that's very helpful. Thank you. One thing I would like to add is about reviews being single-blinded or double-blinded. In my personal case, I always sign my reviews. So, and I make a point when I communicate with the editor that I want my review to be sent out signed. And it's, of course, I would not advise this to everyone, but in my rationale is that all actors involved in the publishing system should be aware of accountability. This is also important to those who review. A reviewer has a very important role, and we should own what we write in our reviews too, I believe. This is the main reason I put my name on it. So I want to be held accountable in case my review is biased, or as you were just explaining, perhaps my point is wrong. I misunderstood the technique that was used. My review is incorrect. I would like to be, therefore my review was not the best as it could have been. Signing my review brings some of the responsibility of that procedure also to the reviewer. The reviewer should also hold that responsibility, in my opinion. However, I do think that for junior researchers, signing reviews may be difficult because they might be in an uncomfortable situation of reviewing a paper from someone who is much more higher in the hierarchy. So what do you think about this?
Again, I think it's a very important point. Like, I agree that open peer review is better. It's fairer, it's more transparent. And actually studies have shown in journals that have used open, transparent peer review that this actually is the case. I mean, for example, Elsevier journals published a survey, allowed their journals to give reviewers the opportunity to be open, and many reviewers chose to do that. And it's been shown that if you allow reviewers to reveal their identity to authors and sign their reviews, you get better peer reviews, you get less rude peer reviews, and you get fairer peer reviews. So it's a good thing. I would advocate for it, absolutely. But higher impact factor journals often do not want to participate in that. And many of the higher impact factor journals mandate double blind for their reviews, because exactly as you've just said. Like, imagine if you were the person responsible for one of your colleagues not getting a paper published in Nature. You may not want that to be revealed, or you may not want, if you're a junior colleague, to have the fact that you reviewed a paper from a more senior professor revealed. So there would be, I think, specific situations where it's probably a better idea to maintain anonymity, but on a case-by-case basis, with the default that we should be open with our peer reviews, I would say. Yeah, because of course it makes you do a better job, and it makes you do a less aggressive job often in many cases.
Yeah,
So
probably the
thing.
latter. Yeah, if you put your name on it, you won't say the same things you would say behind
Right.
anonymity. Yeah, I think I have a question here, and I will verbally pass it to you from one of our HIRAKU Global researchers, Professor Ando, and he's asking you the following. Regarding journal selection, do you have any tips to consider article types? So especially, when is the best to choose short communication or a short article? So according to that, how would you advise the journal selection?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually you'd want to be publishing, or usually, Professor Ando, you'd be publishing a short communication or a shorter article if you have something that you need to communicate with the community quickly, but it's not enough for a full research article. So maybe a new experimental result, or a new protocol, or a new, you know, in my field, like a new discovery, a new fossil or something like that. So you select journals in this case where they're regularly publishing those kinds of papers. And of course, the whole point of publishing a short article is to get that short article out to the community, to your research community, as quickly as possible. So that's what I would go for in those situations. It may be more important to you to get that published quickly than to get that published in a higher impact factor journal. It depends on what you need. It depends on your priorities as a researcher. So those feed into journal selection. But yeah, above all, if it's going to be a short paper, it needs to be published quick. And so you go for a journal that does that and already carries those kinds of articles. Okay. Yeah. So I would say, thanks for the question. Great question.
Thank you for that. So let me do one last round here to see if there is one last minute question. I think we have a raised hand. Let me see. I think we have Professor Tarutani, correct? Can you put your microphone on? Perhaps you can just ask. Yes.
Yes, okay. So my question is almost same as George's one. I actually, in my case, I really dislike the following reviewer's comment, that is add these papers to your introduction part. And you know, in that case, the paper is all from the same corresponding authors. That is kind of the self-citation, I think. But I afraid to reject, especially in the case of the very high impact journal, and sometimes accept that comment. How do you think about the reject that kind of a comment? And can I comment to the editor? This is a very bad behavior.
Yeah, you should talk to the editor in situations like that. I would write an email to the editor, because the reviewer is asking you to cite one of their own papers, right? In order that your paper gets accepted. And that's unethical review behavior. So, but unfortunately, you see that a lot. Like, peer reviewers will say, well, one of my comments is that you should cite more of my papers in your paper, which is, you know, may or may not be valid. I mean, you know, it's possible that that's an important point, that you've missed one of my papers and it's actually necessary for your article, but you're going to know that as the researcher. You're going to know, like, oh, you know, okay, I missed an important citation, But
Mm.
more often than not, peer reviewers are actually trying to get their own citation rate up.
Yeah.
And it's not a fair comment, and that's something that should absolutely be flagged to the editor. So I would say before you send the comments back to the journal, write to the editor and get their approval not to do that. Okay.
Okay. So before sending comment.
Yeah, before you send the comments back, you write an email to the editor saying, I'm about to return my paper, but I have a question about this comment from this peer reviewer. I really don't feel that this is a citation that is important for the study. What do you think, editor? Do you think I should include it or not, given that it's a citation from reviewer 1? Okay. And they'll say not necessary to include it, in which case the reviewer can't then react negatively if you don't include it. Okay.
Okay, I understand. In very polite way.
Yeah, very, very, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important point, because very often authors, they react quick to comments that come back on their papers, and you see something negative that's been written about your work, your immediate impulse is to react. How dare this person write this, or like, and that often gets transmitted back in the comments that you make. My advice is, after you get peer review comments, just do nothing for a week or two. Just let the comments sink in, and then come back and respond to those comments when you've calmed down, especially if the comments are a little bit negative about your own research.
Okay, I understand.
Great question.
Thank you
Thank you for that.